So I'll start with what's going on now. What do you think is likely to happen in Catalonia after the elections in December?
It's very difficult to know because the result went the way the Spanish government didn't want it to go and calculated that it wouldn't. They didn't think that the independent side would be able to win a majority under the conditions that they imposed. I'm not sure why they thought people wouldn't vote for pro-independence parties, because the clampdown was of a nature that you would think that people, and the resistance was quite determined, so people who want to stay on that side were determined to stay on that side. So we're at an impasse, and on Monday the recommendation went to the Spanish government from the Catalonian parliament that Puigdemont should be the new Prime Minister, appointed again, and the government pretty much stay the same. So the ball's in the court of the Spanish government again. I've always thought that this is going to rumble on for not just a number of months, but it may rumble on for years. And I think that's something that the Spanish government are also calculating. They're quite happy for this to be in a kind of impasse. And their hope probably is that the momentum behind the independence movement is somehow slowed down in the coming months.
Looking at the results, like the CUP have lost quite a lot, and so have Catalonia en Comú, whereas like the right-wing party Ciudadanos has gained a lot of votes. So yeah, what do you think about that in terms of the polarisation of the vote?
Well, I think partly it's about polarisation of the vote, and it's not completely about the polarisation of the vote, but maybe I'll take the three different examples in turn. The coup, who are kind of, categorised or characterised in the press as the far left. And, as you would imagine, even in the Catalonian press, not just the Spanish press, they are kind of vilified and characterised in the same way a left-wing party in this country, or left-wing parties in this country have been in the past. Actually, in not too different a way that the Corbyn has been vilified by the right-wing press in this country before the 2017 election. So they found it very, very difficult. And I've spoken to people in CUP, and they say to be an anti-capitalist, feminist and socialist party, and to keep saying that in public, is very, very difficult when you're dealing with a media that doesn't really take something which is kind of alternative to the mainstream like that as seriously as they take the mainstream. So that's the first thing. I think it was always going to be difficult for them in the context of a polarising situation to try and cut through with progressive politics. And I think that's been a problem actually for the other nominally left independence party, Esquerra Republicana. They found it very difficult to get their politics across if it's not about independence. So in that sense, when everything becomes about independence, it's been hard, I think, for CUP, the CUP, to fight for a space in which to have a real political discussion. And the second thing is, and this is kind of from listening to people in Catalonia, a lot of people who would have voted CUP and who have voted CUP in the past voted for Esquerra, and they voted for Esquerra Republicana, who got the biggest support of the left independence parties because out of solidarity, right? So there was a kind of a movement on the left towards a gravitation towards Esquerra Republicana. That's the second reason. The third reason, I think, CUP in their own communications both before and after the election say that we are not an electoral force and never will be. And if you go into an election saying that you never will be an electoral force and you don't want to be an electoral force, what you want to be is a force on the streets, then that's kind of, first of all, it's interesting, but it also tells you that they didn't really prioritise the election. And looking from the outside, it's very clear that they were prioritising other activities, and they prioritised their community organisation activities and not necessarily election. I'll give you one example. They organised a forum for the alternative economy 2 weeks before the election, and they didn't even have their name on the media coverage of it, far less on the publicity. So if you go into an election and you're not prioritised, if you're putting the community before yourself, I think that puts you at a bit of a disadvantage, and that's not a criticism. So those are the three reasons I think the coup didn't do so well. I think the story about the other left party, which is described in the Spanish media as far left, which is not pro-independence, En Comú, Catalonia En Comú, they went down substantially as well. And I think that's because they were seen to be prevaricating over the question of independence after the referendum. They were also seen to be, I think, perhaps a little bit too neutral from the perspective of their constituency on issues around police violence. Now, that's not to say they didn't condemn the police violence, they did. But they have been very, very careful not to upset the people they have political alliances with in Madrid. And I think that has blunted some of their message. So they went into this election without a clear message. I think that's the problem that they have had, and their vote went down. And I think that's one of the consequences that probably we should expect from a situation where the polarisation that you're talking about is not necessarily a left-right polarisation, but it's a polarisation where the debate gravitates almost entirely towards a question of independence rather than a question, or a national question rather than a question of what kind of independence or what should happen now. So finally, you ask about Ciudadanos, the Citizens Party, which was the big success of this election in terms of it got the largest number of votes at 25.4%. My screen tells me. So it was slightly bigger in terms of seats than the Together for Catalonia party, and obviously that was a shock to a lot of people from the outside because they're a very populist and actually very right-wing party. I mean, if you look at their policies, they want to privatise everything that's not been privatised before. They are more neoliberal than the PP. Their populism is very similar to Trump. They're against big government, and so on. But they identify very clearly with a particular section of the working class in Catalonia, and most of the vote comes from the working class that doesn't identify itself as Catalonian first before Spanish. So they were able to get that populist message across, and I think there are two explanations for that. One, it's very clear that the PP vote, the ruling party, it collapsed. And this is a big part of this story. I mean, the PP have no legitimacy in Catalonia whatsoever. It's very, very clear. They polled the lowest votes. They have the lowest number of seats of any of the 7 parties in Catalonia. But most of them, I mean, they never had a very big vote in the first place, but it collapsed, so the residual vote of theirs went to the Citizens Party. So that's the first reason that their popularity was boosted significantly from the last time. The other reason is they're very, very well funded, and nobody really knows exactly where they get their funding from, but they are very, very well funded. When I was in Barcelona walking around 2 weeks before the election, I mean, you would think that they already were the ruling party or something, because they had banners everywhere in the centre of Barcelona. They had certainly visibly the biggest presence. They had those kind of pop-up campaign offices in the streets almost everywhere in the key positions strategically around the centre of Barcelona. So I don't know what they had outside Barcelona and the rest of Catalonia, but certainly the way in which they used that funding to increase their visibility was highly impressive. So I think that's the second reason that we have to say they boosted their vote. They clearly got into the communities and maximised their vote through some very effective and well-funded campaigning. Now, that leaves a question though, and that is, why is a significant proportion of working class people in Catalonia voting for a party which from my perspective is clearly not in their interest. They may identify with the Citizens Party because they are not independentist and they're not nationalist, and I kind of understand that. But instead of going for at the same time, they have been betrayed historically by the Socialist Party. So it's almost analogous to the way in which the Blair Labour Party vote was collapsing until recently. There's no sign that PSOE is going to recover its vote. So in many ways, the working class in Catalonia that don't support independence don't really have anywhere to go. And I think the Catalonia en Comú hope to pick up a lot of that vote, but clearly haven't managed to do that. So we're in a situation where I think you're right, things have polarised, but not in the next step will be to talk about exactly what an alternative Catalonia should look like. That's the only way that any of the political parties and the way in which that political space is going to be captured and populated by those who are going to do well can only be won over and done successfully, populated successfully by those who've got a vision for an alternative Catalonia that's convincing and is going to get some kind of popularity. I think, although the Citizens Party was the biggest party, I don't think they've got that, and I don't think it will be convincing enough to sustain. I think they've won a bit of a protest vote, and I think a bit like UKIP here, we'll see that win.
That was going to be my next question, actually, about the conflicting opinions of what independence should be. You wrote in your article that after the Declaration of Independence, an international solidarity delegation met, hosted by the CUP, to demonstrate solidarity against repression and talk about what the Republic should look like. Also, I read about Puigdemont apparently speaking in Plaza Catalunya in October, like addressing the Catalonian population as like a hardworking, civil, modern European Catalan population in front of screens, picturing not the demonstrations but the politicians and stuff. So do you think there is a sort of division between the sort of more political side of like the Puigdemont coalition and the CUP vision of independence?
Yeah, and I also think, if you look at Esquerra Republicana, there's a lot on the left of that party who would see themselves as differing substantially from Puigdemont's vision and would not necessarily see they have a common interest with or a commitment to a Catalonia that's led by politicians or the usual suspects. So maybe to answer your first question about a kind of more, I guess, popular organisation of Catalonia, which kind of is what the left want. They're not insignificant, by the way. If you combine CUP and Catalonia en Comú, even in this election they got 12% of the vote. I think probably they'll that will creep up again to what they've had for quite a time, which is closer to the region of 20%. And that's not insignificant. It's enough to develop an agenda. There are also a very large number of people within the social movements and the trade union movement who want to participate in this alternative vision of Catalonia. And of course, when we see people going on the streets, if we just look at the last 6 months, I mean, demonstrations of 1 million, 2 million, and sometimes those demonstrations look very different and have very different characteristics. The big independence demonstrations tend to be a whole range of people from all walks of society, including Puigdemont's people that you're talking about on the screen, along with ordinary people. If we look at the big general strike that happened in the 3rd of October it was, so it was 2 days after the referendum, I mean, it was up to 2 million people on the streets from trade unions who were workers. So there's very commonly a very large number of people on the streets who are actively engaging in this political process. And I think it's a mistake to think that this has just been guided by people at the top, because it's clearly not. The big independence demonstrations are being orchestrated by the political centre. There's no doubt about that, right? But the big strikes clearly aren't, right? The big strikes are largely being pushed by people on the left. And this is what makes it interesting, I think. There is a potential for popular power here that goes well beyond what we've seen so far on the political agendas. And certainly goes beyond the kind of Puigdemont vision that you're talking about. And I'll give you one example of why that's important. I mean, what really polarised the EU was that 3rd of October general strike. You know, the EU were kind of prevaricating about, and I mean, all of the institutions of the EU have really been prevaricating about how to respond to this. I think one of the key moments was that the point at which the EU began to kind of quieten down about, and it, you know, at some point it was arguing consistently for an open referendum to let the people decide. The minute that finished was when they saw large numbers of workers on the streets, and I think that's kind of important, because the agenda that a number of people, if not the majority of people in Catalonia, want is not the same agenda that we see being pushed in Brussels, right? And I think that because of that level of kind of popular demonstrative power on the streets, and also the tradition of participatory democracy in Catalonia, it makes it much more interesting than we are kind of seeing from where we are. And the other aspect to your question about what that might look like or what that might mean, I mean, again, that's up in the air. The thing I do know is that I think, compared to almost anywhere else in Europe, Catalonia at a local level has the most interesting alternative economic experiments. So, you know, you'll find different towns around Catalonia where energy has been taken back into public ownership, where the water's been taken back into public ownership. It has a huge cooperative sector, and it has a very well organised cooperative sector. There are hundreds of cooperatives in Catalonia that deal with everything from those energy supply companies to collectives of lawyers, architects, and so on. So I mean, Catalonia in many ways has got the broadest range of alternative economic experiments, including, by the way, experiments which deal with the maintenance of basics like food supplies. Food sovereignty is a major priority for people, particularly in rural communities in Catalonia. So I think there are some already really practical examples of how the economy can be organised in an alternative sense, of alternatives to capitalism. And these need to be unleashed. The question is whether they will be unleashed and whether there can be a kind of movement which really brings those to the fore and allows those to be part of a new Catalonian republic whenever it arrives. That's the big question. But the examples are there.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I'm being too pessimistic from looking at the news, but it seems to be that these left-wing groups that also basically let the referendum take place when all the police violence was going on and stuff, that it just seems to have faded away and become a sort of political issue around Puigdemont fleeing to Brussels. Do you think these events have all strengthened these local left-wing alternatives, or do you think it's sort of not really made a big difference?
I mean, I think partly what you're talking about is what politics does, is what big politics. Okay, let's distinguish between the everyday politics that we're all involved in, and we all have to deal with, whether that's in our workplace or our daily lives, or whatever, right? We all have to deal with a whole range of political disputes and discussions all the time, right? But the big formal politics, where politics in a formal sense happens, the parliaments or the council chambers, and so on. I mean, there is a tendency for politics to be sucked into those fora, particularly at those moments of crisis. And I think to some extent you're right that probably the Spanish government has been quite successful in limiting the political discussion or the key discussions of alternatives in Catalonia to questions of big politics. What happens to Puigdemont or you know, what happens right now to the constitution of the new Catalonian government. Now, I'm not saying these are not important. These are crucial issues, and in many ways, that's why we get sucked into that kind of discussion. But it's not the way in which we can really affect change, because to affect change, there needs to be some kind of pressure from power, from either people power or from other sources of power, right? What we might call social forces, and you know, that might be big business, or it might be other lobbying interests, it might be trade unions, it might be other forms of organisation, right? But the pressure for political decisions always comes from social power, right? Now, when we see particular moments like this, it looks like there's no social power involved at all, right? But in fact, what's going on right now in Catalonia is a very carefully orchestrated kind of dance, which is influenced by also a whole range of powerful forces. And the reason Spain isn't moving quickly right now is because they're scared of people on the streets. They're scared of popular power. I think the reason that the Puigdemont and the Catalonian government have probably been a bit more restrained than they could have been is also because they're scared in this moment that they might lose their position to popular power, but also because there's also a very fine balance of commercial and business interests in Catalonia right now. We've seen some businesses leave Catalonia, and there's a threat for other major economic powerhouses to leave Catalonia. So there's a kind of, no pun intended, cat and mouse game going on, which is always looking to the social forces beyond the formal politics. So just because you don't see those social forces visibly, it doesn't mean that they're not there. Now, the problem, of course, is when the debates are just focused on the big politics. It's very difficult for ordinary people to see how they play a part in it. And in a way, I would say what we're seeing today is the flaw with liberal democracy, right? It's not as democratic as we think it is. Things tend to gravitate to the centre and tend to be controlled by those in power.
Do you think the pro-independent left was like expecting anything more from these events then, or do you think it was?
I think it probably didn't expect his vote to decline quite so substantially. I think, you know, there's another consequence of the fact that let's take COOP, right? You know, there's another consequence that of the commitment of COOP to being a much more kind of democratically organised party in terms of principles of participatory democracy. So it encourages maximum participation. Most of the decisions it makes are made in these constituent assemblies that people meet in en masse. But also it means that they change MPs at every election. So they put 4 new candidates up this time round, and that they put more. I think most of the list was new candidates, but the 4 that were elected, I think 3 of them are new out of the 4 are new MPs, and they lost some very well known, very high profile spokespeople. And that's also. I mean, I think they knew they probably were risking taking a loss because they have that position, and their hope is that the culture of politics will change so that people don't need to vote for recognisable faces all the time, that what they're voting for is a particular kind of politics. So I think they are a bit surprised, but their solution is not to look to the parliament. Their solution is to look back to the constituency, and that's where their efforts are now in building in those local constituent assemblies.
Given the degree of polarization between pro-independence and people against independence, I was wondering why that didn't reflect into the initial referendum vote. Like those that voted, although like not a huge turnout, all voted overwhelmingly pro-independence. That was just my curiosity.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's clear why there wasn't a huge turnout. People were scared.
Yeah.
And also, well, not everyone was scared. I mean, obviously, there was a huge number of people who were very brave. I mean, I was there on the day, and I went to a polling station where there was very little going on. And about 8:30, I went to go and get a coffee in a local place. And when I went in, the television images already had started coming through. There was this kind of, I mean, and it was incredible. I mean, you could see people being dragged, women being dragged by the hair in the earliest, I can't remember exactly which polling station it was, but it was in the earliest coverage. So if you're preparing to go out to vote, and you see that in your television, you're not going to go out to vote. It was very clear that people who were going to vote, very many of them, probably felt that they had to fight with the police.
Yeah.
So a 40, what was it, 46?
I think it was high 40s.
Yeah, turnout at that kind of rate. Actually, I was surprised at how high it was after seeing that. And then, of course, almost 90% to vote in favour. That clearly reflects the people who were determined to vote with the people who were going to vote yes.
That perhaps goes back to what you were saying before about the Ciudadanos vote probably not lasting that long, as strong as it is. Like, doesn't seem to be that the anti-independence side are like as passionate as the pro-independence. Maybe.
I think that's partly right, but I also think there are a lot of people on the left who will leave independence as an idea behind if they don't think it offers real change. And that goes back to the point I made about winning the political space. This is the crucial time when the political space has to be won. And I think if the left, and this is my political sympathy, so you could say I'm being biased, but I do think that if the left doesn't win that political space, and I don't just mean a kind of vague left, I mean a left offering alternatives to a system in which most people in Spain have been hammered by austerity and have found their lives significantly more impoverished. Unemployment, particularly amongst young people, has gone through the roof. Educational opportunities have been withdrawn from young people. And unless there's an alternative to that kind of precarious economics, then really I don't think the independence project will last very long, actually. So that but going back to the referendum, I also don't think. I mean, it's almost implausible to think that the kind of 90% of the people who voted were all of the people who wanted to vote for independence. I think there's probably a fairly sizable bulk of people who are not voting for the pro-independence parties who would vote pro-independence, and that's an interesting question itself. I don't think, of course, the election in the Catalonian Parliament balances things fairly finely in the sense that the pro-independence parties have got a slim majority, and the polls vary. Like the polls seem to be indicating a slight majority for independence. When you ask people if they want a referendum on independence, then the results are much higher. I mean, you're talking, into 60s, 70s, and even higher. People who want the right to choose. And that tells me that if you call a referendum under the same conditions that we had in Scotland, that maybe some of the real politics about real alternatives, about what independence, self-determination might offer, might be able to open up a more interesting political space. And people, who knows, people might be more inclined to vote for a change on that basis.
One last question. Do you think the debate about independence is still a lot to do with anti-fascism, given that a lot of the mobilisation happened after the police violence?
Yeah, I think, I think you can't really talk about Catalonia without thinking about its fascist and anti-fascist past. I mean, it overshadows everything. I wouldn't characterise exactly how the Spanish state has reacted as fascist, but there have been a number of disturbing things that have emerged since the referendum. One of them has been the Falange, Franco's political party, which was kind of a fringe outfit that didn't really dare to show its face much in public, is now openly marching on the streets. It was in November, the leader of the Falange was marching openly in Zaragoza. The rise in fascist attacks on anti-racist organisations and on black people, indeed, and on pro-independence campaigners. Again, a couple of weeks after the referendum, there was a very significant show of fascists in Valencia where they attacked pro-independence demonstrators, and that has continued. So that very ugly face, which was kind of below the surface in Spanish politics, has risen to the fore. And I have to say, I think that's been very calculated. I don't think that the PP, the ruling party, has deliberately manufactured fascist violence, but it knew that was a risk, and it's been playing a very, very dangerous game. And it's been encouraging a kind of anti-Catalan politics, which is verging on the hatred for any Catalonian identity, that has certainly stimulated this. We've also seen within the police, particularly the Spanish National Police, we've seen several leaked images of police officers meeting with fascists in bars and so on, and giving the fascist salute, and that's, I mean, that's certainly not saying that's the majority, but that element is there and has never gone away since Franco. So I think if you are in charge of a state which imposes arbitrary rule, arbitrary law, I would argue unconstitutionally on that state, and it uses its police as an occupying force, you have to remember that it's years and years and years since the Spanish National Police and the Guardia Civil were able to police the streets in the way that the Spanish government has allowed them to do that. I mean, they are behaving as a force of occupation would, right? So it's almost as if you have a hostile government with a force of occupation on the streets of another government. Whilst there are tanks, they've admitted they've got tanks at the ready. They've also got the all of the reinforcements still in the harbours, sitting on those barrack garrison ships. So I'm not saying this is fascism, right? But this is a state of exception. This is the normal rule of law has been suspended by the Spanish state to impose a pure form of force on the Catalonian people, to the point that it doesn't even allow its government to make any decisions. The local police and indeed all local officials are under their command. It means that it's a pretty extreme form of government that in other contexts might be described as fascist, actually. I don't think the kind of anti-fascist character of the independence movement is going to go away until Rajoy withdraws the troops and allows Catalonian autonomy to be restored.